Mel Cooper, and today I'm in conversation with Hugh Thomas in his home. Thomas is the man who wrote the first, most important still, and probably definitive book about the history of the Spanish Civil War. He's been a great scholar of Spanish history, and particularly of the imperial period, ever since. There's a book on Cuba, which is possibly everything you've ever wanted to know about Cuba, and now he's 2/3 of the way through a sequence of books about the great golden age of the Spanish Empire from the time of Ferdinand and Isabella through to the end of the reign of Philip II. Hugh, thank you so much for being with us today. The first question I want to ask you is that I know you're a son of empire, of the British Empire. How did you become interested in the Spanish Empire?
Well, I have become interested in the Spanish past very strongly, and I think of myself as the historian of the Spanish Empire rather than the historian of the Spanish Civil War. I remember the Civil War, of course, my book above all. I remember the details, and I could have an argument about various details. Juan Negrin, for example, or the role of the Falange, or how Lorca died, for example. But basically speaking, I am concerned with the 16th century, and I must say it is fair to say that Spain in the 16th century, though a harsh place in many respects, was more tolerant than the 20th century. Cervantes, after all, Don Quixote, is not a gloomy book at all. It's full of jokes and full of extraordinary accidental happenings of great entertainment. King Philip II is represented, because of his role in the Armada, as being a bleak figure. But in fact, he was a cultivated one, and I don't think in history there's ever been a monarch who has lived for longer before he came to the throne in other countries. He lived a year in England, he lived about 2 years in Flanders, he was for a long time in Germany, a bit of it in Italy. No one was like that. As a matter of fact, Mr. Cameron hasn't lived as long as that outside England. He was a very organized monarch. He was determined to have his capital in one place rather than move from place to place, which his father and his grandfather had done always. If you look at the list of places where Ferdinand and Isabel were, it's just as many as those where Charles V was. And there's some good books which tell us where those monarchs were every day of their lives. But Philip, once he came back from the Low Countries in 1557, 1558, settled down principally in the Escorial, which he had built for himself. And there he had his archives, he had his documents, and there he had the center of his empire, which of course stretched to the Pacific, as well as at times touching into the Indian Ocean.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the way you've built the book, not just around the actual development of the history, but around particular characters. So that for me, in a way, one of the major protagonists, of course, is Charles V, but another one is Pizarro. I found that whole story of Peru very, very interesting.
Well, I think Pizarro is not a hero to most people. He's always considered to be an illiterate and rough individual, a very good leader of men, but not able to communicate by letter to anyone. And that was not the case with Cortes. And people think, well, Cortes, of course, could write very well. He was very sophisticated, but he was on a different level to Pizarro. Actually, Pizarro has his points.
I thought the way you presented him made him seem very strong and very interesting, precisely because he had these limitations. It was almost as if he was a kind of a terrific protagonist for the story.
There was a moment when Atahualpa, the king or the emperor of the Inca, realized that he couldn't read, and that was that Pizarro couldn't read. And that was something which he thought that was a weakness among the conquering Spaniards.
But what you were dealing with then in this book really is the sort of the absolute moment, the 30, 40 years when everything just came together, and they had the new colonies, and everything was being discovered and explored, and they were pulling it all into what became probably the most powerful empire of that era.
Well, the empire was a very large undertaking because there was Cortes carried through his conquest of Mexico in the early years of Charles V, which comes in an earlier volume. Then Pizarro carried through his conquests in Peru. The much more tolerant and cultivated Valdivia went to Chile and wrote many interesting letters, which are still worth reading, to Charles V. And there were other conquistadors in the northern part of South America, Jiménez de Quesada, for example, or Federman in Venezuela, Colombia. And there were also conquistadors in the Rio Plate. A reasonable conquistador, and there were those, all thought that that money was an important factor, but they wanted glory because they were Renaissance men. They wanted the expansion of Christianity, and there was an element of curiosity. What on earth is going on behind that net, that cape which we can't see? Is it possible there are Amazons there, or men with one eye in the middle of their foreheads? Quite likely, because a friend of mine who has been there has seen such a person with only one eye, sticking out, as a matter of fact. It was a very curious experience for him. He's never recovered. Really, it happened. And this these elements were the motives of most conquistadors. This was a period of extraordinary addition to the Spanish world. And it still is, of course, a part of the Spanish world with some qualifications, but still, intellectually, South America is a part of Spain. Ferdinand and Isabel did unite Spain. They brought in Aragon and Catalonia under the same crown as Castile. They reduced the Moors in Granada, and they also absorbed Navarre in the north. And so there was a sense that Spain existed at last, or for the first time, in their time. And there's quite a good story, which I think I've quoted somewhere, where a group of Spaniards were discussing their origins, somewhere in Costa Rica or something like that. And somebody said, of course, he was a Catalan. Somebody said he came from Sevilla. Somebody else said, I'm actually from Galicia, near Santiago. Then somebody else said, but we're all Spaniards, realize that. And that was quite an important moment. I'm not sure we were, because there's a slightly vociferous quality of modern Spain, and I'm not sure that people would say the same if it happened now, but it certainly did happen at least one occasion then.
Well, my impression is that you've created a trilogy, that you're beginning with the start of Spain, as it were, with Ferdinand and Isabel, working into how this all opened up and changed because of the discovery of America and the empire and the growth of the empire. And the middle book is sort of the golden era. And then the third book is the story of Philip II, really, and how he takes it forward, and yet he also comes to a stop.
This involves fewer conquests, although the conquest of the Philippines is not to be ignored. And the Armada shouldn't be forgotten and will not be forgotten. But what I will deal with in particular is Philip II's wise decision, as it must seem to be, not to conquer China. He was told by the governor of Manila and the bishop of Manila, who never agreed on anything except for this, that if the king put at their disposal several thousand men and about 30 ships, they would do for him, the King Philip, in China, what Cortes had done for his father in Mexico, that is to say, conquer a new world. But Philip hesitated, rightly.
But do we know why? Do we know what his thinking was?
Yes, he thought he had too much on his plate anyway, because he just absorbed.
Who needs another world?
He had just absorbed the Portuguese Empire, and he hadn't completely decided how to control that, which he ultimately did not remain a part of the Spanish Empire. But in 1580, Portugal and its empire was absorbed by Spain by inheritance. This lasted till 1640, when there was a Portuguese rebellion, and leading to the creation of modern Portugal and the great empire in Brazil particularly, but also in the Far East. Philip decided, I think, not to have a Chinese adventure because of reasons of imperial overstretch, which most empires don't consider or don't allow themselves to be influenced by.
My impression is that as part of your interest in Spain, you then got taken up with something like Cuba, where for me you've written the strongest, longest, and most definitive book about the history of Cuba and all the things that happened there.
Well, Cuba was conquered by the Spaniards in 1511, I think, and has remained a Spanish colony
Until the Americans interfered.
Till 1898. There was a governor, a captain general, who ran Cuba for Spain all those years. It wasn't so important as a sugar colony till the late 18th century, and it's possible that the British occupation of Havana in 1762 was a trigger leading to the realization that sugar could be a great source of profit and prosperity, which it became pretty soon after the English left. We considered hanging on to Cuba in 1763 at the Treaty of Paris, but that the group of conservative MPs who expressed themselves as the take and hold movement were defeated in the discussions.
I have to say, too, that, of course, all that stuff you've been referring to is the reason that Canadians are English, as it were. I mean, it was Canada or a couple of sugar islands, wasn't it? And somebody bright thought, we'll have Canada instead of the sugar islands.
That's correct. And Voltaire said, England has added a continent of ice to her empire. And that was Canada.
Yes, and as one who grew up shoveling snow, I can tell you he was dead right. Hugh, I want to thank you so much for being with us and sharing all that with us today.